Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Cassidy Williams, who is a software engineer, advisor, investor, podcaster, professional memer, mechanical keyboard maker, etc., etc., etc. Cassidy joins us from Chicago, Illinois. Cassidy Williams, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
I think the number one thing is how fast someone can jump in and just start working on it. Just someone who has no context. And so that turns into a lot of things like, is it well documented? Is it modular? Can you just read the code in general? One thing that I say that can be controversial is that it's not too clever, where sometimes it's really fun to write really clever code and you're like, dang, I'm a genius. This is amazing. But if it's too clever and someone can't edit it later, whether it's someone else or you in the future, that's not good code, or that's not maintainable code, rather.
What do you think makes for, in your experience, good documentation for, say, that onboarding experience?
I do think there's a balance between too much and too little, because there are times where some people document just way too much to the point where you're just like, okay, I get it. This is an if statement. I can read that. There is such thing as code that is self-explanatory. That being said, I think good documentation in the code, outside of like actual docs outside of the code, I think kind of gives you a tour of where you should be and being like, okay, this is where this is used. This is how this is used. That kind of stuff. So that way, as you navigate through the code base, you know, okay, this is generally what I should be doing, where I should be going.
That's interesting. You think about the inline versus like a README or set up instructions for things. How descriptive do you find like that's gotten better over the course of your career, that those types of documentations has improved for teams that you've been part of or joined, or do you feel like it's been kind of consistent throughout the course of your career?
I think some aspects have gotten better. I think that external documentation, like not inline in the code, has gotten better by a lot just because there's so many good tools out there. I was just looking at the open source project Scalar, and they have just really nice documentation generation sites and things like that where there's just so many tools that exist now. And then inline, I admit, I think some parts of it have gotten better, but it feels like it kind of stagnated. I feel like most people rely on the external rather than the inline these days.
Can you think of a time that you were joining an existing code base that you recall it being rather cumbersome? And
most of them. I feel like at least half the time I enter a code base, I'm like, oh no, what's this? And then most of the engineers are like, yeah, we know. Like I feel like that's the general theme. And honestly, I'm not saying this about other people, even my own software, where I'm just like, oh no, I haven't maintained this in like 2 or 3 years. What did I do? What was this past, Cassidy? What have you done? Which is a sign of growth, I think. But anyway, I think that most code bases, they start perfect, quote unquote, and pristine with well-documented things and components and design systems in place. And then over time, it's just not as prioritized. And I feel like that's just the nature of the beast as software gets larger and larger.
Or is it pivots, maybe?
That's also a very true thing. That's actually the code base where I just came from, where my company went through so many different pivots. A lot of times we were just like, okay, the backend does this because of the previous iteration of the software. So we have to just let this happen. We can rewrite that later. The whole we can rewrite that later ends up never happening, but it's the intention.
Is that someday maybe? Have you ever actually landed on one of those days? You find yourself like, this is actually the day we can do the thing that we said we were going to do.
Yeah, those days are magical when you're just suddenly able to unlock that and you're like, yes, we are actually rewriting this thing. And it feels like the clouds are parting, where it's painful, but it's kind of like when you detangle headphone cables, where it's like such a pain in the moment, but then once it's done, it's just like, I've done it, and it's beautiful.
It'll never happen again. And then 6 months later, you find that box of cables again. I was just pulling some laundry out of the dryer earlier, and 3 different pairs of running shorts decided to have all of their drawstrings get wrapped up together.
Oh no, that's annoying.
And I was like, is this... this isn't helping me with my run this morning. Totally off topic. You had mentioned, kind of starting off at the top about how fast someone can join a project and start contributing. And do you have a sense of personally when you're joining a project or a team with existing software base, how quickly you like to be able to show that you can make some sort of impact or introduce some changes to the code base versus just getting it up and running in your local development environment?
This is one of those, like, it depends, because it really does depend on the software and the stack and stuff, because there's some things where it's just the nature of the beast. You're going to have to get a really specific Docker container configured and everything. And then there's other things where it's just like npm install go. And so it depends on a whole lot of different things. I kind of use the metric for external developers. It's time to hello world, or it's like how fast can someone who is not actually on the team, but like using the API, using a product, or just contributing to open source, how fast can they just get there? Because if you can do that in like less than 5 minutes for an external person, that's incredible. Not common, but incredible. I think for internal, again, it kind of depends on the team that you're joining and the stack that they're using. If I can be up and running in less than a half hour, I'm very happy.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. That actually feels like pretty quick too, from a lot of what I've seen over the year. But over the years, what's your take on the metaphor technical debt? Do you use that very often in your work, or?
Yes, I mean, I also definitely think all code is technical debt at one point, where like it's beautiful until it's not. And once again, code that you write now, you're probably going to look at it in like 2 or 3 years, and you'll be like, that isn't that good, is it? And once again, that's growth, that's good, but it's a thing. I think that there is definitely a balance of technical debt and like just, this is just how the code is. It's not debt, it's just something that works. I think there's that balance of how painful is it to actually maintain, and like, does it actively take time away from other feature development? Because if it's old but it works, it does the thing, you don't have to jump through too many hoops to just get to the next feature that you want to add or something, then that's not too deady, that's just old. But if it starts to actually take away from new development time or just maintenance time, that's when I lean more on the debt scale.
Do you, I don't actually know this. I didn't go do a deep dive in all the different sort of programming languages and frameworks that you've worked on over the years. But how would you kind of describe yourself? Like, is there a part of the stack that you've tended to work more predominantly on and have more experience in, or have you kind of covered the gamut over the course of your career?
I have covered the gamut, but I call myself a front-end engineer because I just like front-end a whole lot more. Yes, I can spin up a backend if I have to, but I don't want to most of the time. Where I started my career as a backend engineer, and once I saw the light with the front end, I just had a lot more fun and kind of leaned into that.
What is it about, as someone that might describe themselves more as a backend developer, what is it about the front? Because I think for a long time I was always a little bit like, that it feels a little bit more brittle in some ways, I think, at times, especially with a lot of, and I also come from, back in the era of being, just growing very exhausted with browser testing and different device sizes coming out and mobile devices. And I was like, there's other people that just seem to wrap their head around this and can navigate that and be like, it's just too many variables. So what was the attraction to that for you?
That is a very real thing. There's a beauty of back-end development where like all the tests pass and it's just green and you're like, wow, I've done it and that's it. And then front end, you're just like, well, the nav bar works on most screens. So that is very much a thing for sure. I think I'm just visual. I think I just really learned that about myself, where I like being able to see all of the different ways that I can break a screen, test a screen, change a screen, and how things can work at the different breakpoints and different screen sizes and stuff. And it's very fun to feel like I'm drawing, but it's code.
Thanks. That was a good way to kind of help me understand the mind of a front-end person. I know you don't speak for all front-end developers, but that, to provide a little bit of context for the audience, Cassidy and I just met for the first time in person in Berlin because we were both invited to speak to a conference there called The Merge, which is a developer experience conference. And I had an opportunity to hear Cassidy speak about being involved in a number of projects, but in a recent case, business and learning to embrace the pivot, which is why I mentioned the pivoting earlier. And I was wondering, someone that's, had a long career so far and seems to have done a lot of different things over the years and does a lot of speaking and podcasting and is a professional memer in a way, funny person on the internet and teaching technology things to people and like having good communities that you've built in over the years. How do you think about pivoting and sustaining a career and kind of navigating that?
That's really relevant to where I'm at right now. For some context for everybody, yes, we spoke at the Merge, and my startup, we are basically splitting up, open sourcing, and moving on to future roles at this point. And so because of that, I'm doing this kind of reflection right now of what is next. Because I think luckily at this point in my life, I have the privilege of being able to be a little bit slow about it, where there have been times where I'm like, okay, got to get to the next role. And I just kind of pick the offer that I get next. And then there have been other times where I interview a couple times, but then that's it. And this time feels different because I have a little bit of time to make a decision, and I'm very grateful for that, because I did immediately start like the interviewing process with companies. And then I realized as I was getting to offer stages, I was like, I don't actually think I want a couple of these roles where like I'm grateful to have the interview process and stuff, but it's something that I can do, but not necessarily what I want to do. And so right now I'm kind of figuring out, do I want to stick with startups because I genuinely enjoy startups and I think they're very fun? Or should I try a larger company now where there's much more resources, much more benefits, that sort of thing? Do I want to go into more of the leadership side again? Because I was CTO of my previous startup, and so I did a lot of like sales meetings, investor meetings, business meetings, in addition to actual coding and working with my developers. Or do I want to just be an individual contributor where I'm just writing code and kind of at peace with that? There's pros and cons to all the things, and there's a term that Sheryl Sandberg used that I think is very accurate, where it's not necessarily a career ladder, it's a career jungle gym. And I am traversing the jungle gym right now and trying to be thoughtful about not only what do I want, but what do I want the next several years to be like, because I don't want to just like go in a role and be like, 6 months later, it's not for me. I'd like to be in a place long enough where I can learn a lot and get deep.
No, that's an interesting timing for us. And I think maybe, who knows when this episode will get published, but usually like a month and a half, 2 months ahead of schedule. So maybe, who knows, maybe. But you have this opportunity to think through that. Just being open about this is, from my end, I've been running a company for many years now that like I didn't like intentionally set out like I'm going to run a consulting agency. Like opportunities popped up. And I was like, what the hell? I'll give it a go. Let's see. Worst thing happens, I just go back to doing what I was doing before, which was being as like a freelancer, and maybe I get a job at some point if I have to. So I've always known that could be potentially an option. But when you run a company for 2 decades, I don't often have that. Feel like I have a lot of opportunities to have all those conversations, because there's a lot of other impact about like, well, what happens to my company? What happens to my team? What happens to all my clients? Like I've already built up this, it's like career debt, I guess, maybe in a way, like technical debt, but it's just like, there's things I'm supposedly responsible for. And so I'm kind of always curious when I get to hear people talk about these phases of their life. And I'm like, what would that be like? What if sometimes I fantasize, like, what if all my clients fired me tomorrow and then I had to do something? What would I do? How would I navigate my career jungle gym? Curious to hear how
It's
that's
almost nerve-wracking, but it's also freeing, and freeing always comes with a little bit of fear. And so that's kind of what I'm figuring out, because kind of like what you said, especially because I was in leadership at this startup and doing all of these sales and stuff, I was thinking, oh no, the customers, oh no, that my team, oh no, our investors, like so many things, and kind of put myself last in a lot of ways. And so it's weird putting myself first and being like, I get to just choose what I want to do now. And it's also just a weird economy and stuff in general. And there's so many factors in there. And I've been doing my own freelancing and consulting until then, well, in between roles, and doing like just well enough where I'm like, I could just do this, or I could work for a place. Who knows? We'll see.
I commend you for navigating that and looking forward to hearing where you end up next. Maybe you end up where you're at. Who knows?
Thank you.
Let's, one of the things I want to give you a chance to do is let's plug your Patreon.
Oh, sure. Hey, everybody. Yeah, well, and so my Patreon, I admit, it's not a big money-making thing, but it's a really nice community. And so I have a Patreon where I originally made it to help people with interview prep, to help people with resume reviews, and that was kind of like the core feature, quote unquote, of it. If you're at the top tier, I feature you in my newsletter, that kind of thing. But what it kind of became, particularly in the pandemic, is just a really active Discord community. And so like the lowest tier is the lowest number that Patreon would let me go. It's $2 a month, and then it goes up from there. But that gives you access to the Discord, and it has been so nice. It's been going for about 5 years now. Actually, exactly 5 years now, because it was July 2019 when I started it. And yeah, so you can hear the timing. That was when I started, and I was just like, we'll see if people want to talk to me in there, and otherwise it'll just be the place where I do these mock interviews and stuff. But it kind of became that third place for a lot of people, especially in the pandemic when we couldn't go outside, but there's this nice internet community here. And because it's this low price of $2 a month, there aren't spammers, because spammers don't pay money. But it's like just gated enough that it feels open, and it is just a delightful internet community. Like this is like, I was just thinking I should write like a love letter to this community, because it's been so great to talk to people about blog posts they're writing. We do like quote unquote mini conferences where we just give talks to each other. We have seen people go through so many different career changes and life changes and stuff in there, and it's really nice to have that kind of corner of the internet that feels like we're in control of it a little bit, rather than all of the social medias that have been changing and run by bots and stuff like that. And so anyway, that is a very, very long plug for my little Patreon group if you want to join our Discord. And if $2 a month is too high, just DM me and I got you covered.
Let's see. One of the things, when I was preparing for the conversation, you mentioned a project that you had worked on at Netlify, where you had worked on a router upgrade during your time there. So could you tell us a little bit about that experience as far as working on an existing code base and how you kind of helped navigate that?
When I was at Netlify, I was on the developer experience team, which typically was mostly working with external developers and open source, where we were kind of just helping developers use the Netlify platform, see the possibilities, that sort of thing. But what I really liked about that team, and that was particularly unique, is that we all did rotations on the product team, where we worked with the product team for, sometimes it was a quarter, sometimes it was half a year, sometimes even longer than that, but we just worked with the product team on something based on our learnings externally. And so my rotation on the product team was working on the router, which sounds like kind of a silly thing, because it's just like, oh, that's just the thing that navigates the URLs on the front end. No big deal. But it is a big deal. And so my experience was a bit unique as well, in that before Netlify, before the pandemic, I was teaching React full-time with the folks who created React Router, Ryan Florence and Michael Jackson, who now have made Remix and sold it to Shopify and do all of that full time now. But anyway, we were all teaching workshops professionally. And so I got really, really good at React Router because I was working with that team and helping maintain some code as well as teach the code as my full-time gig. And so when I was on the rotation for this team, I think a lot of people were a little nervous because they were like, we know we need to update it, but our router is at like V3. And at that point it was the version V5, which was a particularly large breaking change to change. And so it definitely involved getting some buy-in from stakeholders. That's the synergistic business phrase. But like getting people to say like, okay, this is what we get. This is the value we get from upgrading the router. These are the necessary changes we'd have to make. This is how much the code base will change, but these are the benefits we'll get from the code base changing. And there was a lot of that, and something that I was, again, uniquely able to do was I was able to actually bring in the maintainer team of React Router, Ryan and Michael, to answer questions for the team, where they were able to say like, okay, yes, these are the things that you're going to have to change. These are the things that are going to be hairy. These are the things that'll actually be pretty easy based on your code base. And so they were really kind in being a part of that process, that human side of it, because I feel like a lot of big legacy changes are way more human than actual code, at least initially. And then yeah, from there it was just getting in the weeds and actually writing the code. Once we got like buy-in and the thumbs up from everybody to be like, okay, yes, this change needs to happen, it was just Code City, where we called it mob programming, where we were just coding as a group rather than pair programming, where we were saying, okay, this person is going to do these routes. Let's see where we have to go. Okay, these person is going to do these routes. These people are going to rewrite these components. And we were kind of just on a big Zoom call and sharing a screen, and we would kind of rotate between who was working on what. And it was a very, very massive branch, but we figured out a way to do it somewhat incrementally. And it was honestly a pleasure. Like the team was really, really nice. And once again, it's like that detangling the headphones or cords or strings, what have you, where once it was done, we were just like, wow, we've done it. But in the moment, it was definitely hairy, and we kind of had to just heads down do it. But it was really great working with that team and getting it all done together.
We'll be right back with our interview with Cassidy in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for making time to listen to Maintainable. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, is there someone you think I should have on the podcast sometime? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Cassidy Williams. That's awesome. I'm curious about two things that you share from that story. One, I really want to dig into the open source, bringing in the maintainers from Web Project into the conversations internally. Have that one sidebar for that for just a moment. But I'm curious about, when you're working on that type of thing, was there a lot of like automated testings or like QA checklist things that your team was needing to do to validate that things were still working through that process after going through the React Router upgrade?
Yeah, there were tests. I admit this was now like 3 years ago, so I don't fully remember the details of that, but there were tests, there were automations, things had to be updated. Luckily, I think it was relatively painless compared to what could have been, because it was mostly the front-end router, and so we didn't have to deal with anything on the API that was changing. But luckily, that, from what I recall, was relatively painless. And bringing in maintainers, I think that was a lucky thing, because once again, they were buddies of mine after working with them. I've actually seen a few teams bring in open source maintainers to do those sorts of calls, and it's just a consulting thing. And you can think of it as you're supporting open source by paying the maintainers, and then also getting very bespoke help on your code base because they really know the technology that you're using.
Thinking about this, what I wanted to kind of talk about with for our listeners to consider is that sometimes there may be a worry that developers might feel like, well, I need to be able to figure this out myself because there's no extra budget maybe. And like, they don't even think like, oh, maybe we'd have to pay spend a couple $1,000s, or I don't know how much you might have needed to spend in that scenario for that, for a couple conversations, but that might vary depending on who the project or who you're trying to bring in to help get some advice on. But if you don't know how much that budget's going to be until you ask the person, like, hey, how much might it take? If you approach an open source person, they might be willing to do it for free, maybe just as maybe a LinkedIn recommendation, or be a depending on where they're at in their career, but offer to pay them if you can. But I think that doesn't often, I think, occur to people. Like, you could probably just go ask the person that did most of the work on this thing. They're very public about what they're doing most of the time, and you could literally just like have them come in and help you out for a couple of days potentially, and that might be cheaper than you hitting your head against the wall for weeks trying to figure this out yourself. So wanted to throw that out there. I think that's an untapped resource, and then it also maybe be useful feedback for those people too, because in that scenario, if they're like, here's the upgrade guide for, we made these these breaking changes between X and Y version, how do you navigate this? And I think it's one thing like, hey, we made all these changes and all these new features, but if the upgrade guide's not really helping you do what you need to do, that's a good opportunity to be like, hey, I don't really know how to get from A to B. I've looked at your documentation. I'm confused and I don't know how to apply that to my scenario. And I think that's why a lot of teams end up not upgrading some libraries, because they're just like, we don't know, or maybe the project got deprecated or they're no longer working on it. Like, hey, can you recommend a different project? Did you migrate to something else? Could you tell us about that? Why did you abandon your project? What's the potential replacement? So just some thoughts to throw out there. Do you have any?
Yeah, and I think there's also like a curiosity from maintainers. They often like to see how things are being used, or they look at it, they're just like, okay, so what are you doing here? Why would you do this? And it's interesting to see them figure out, oh, there are use cases that we didn't even consider in our libraries. And I've actually had these kinds of meetings with other maintainers before. I think it is very untapped, and once again, it's often beneficial to the maintainers, because yes, you can pay them and you can also write case studies about them. You can also say, this is the technology we're using. You can support them in so many different ways that they probably don't get supported enough. Yeah, so many ways. Anyway, it's only beneficial most of the time.
Go talk to your open source maintainers. Ask them for some help, and share. I think you mentioning, like, they're probably very curious to learn about how their tools are being used. Who doesn't like to hear about how their stuff is being used, unless they're using it wrong?
Yeah, well, and even then, you're just like, how are you using it? Why?
For those listening who might be hitting a challenge and might be involved, needing to dive deeper into the internals of, say, an external library, do you have any advice on how you might approach those maintainers then?
A lot of maintainers are pretty, once again, public about where they want to be contacted and how, because people do contact them about various things, and they often do have, this is the support email, this is the consulting rate, or something like that. A lot of experienced maintainers do have that. Check the contributing guide, check who's making commits. Chances are a maintainer has a website or some kind of social media profile that you can contact. You'd be surprised how many maintainers already have some kind of like contact us page and stuff, especially for the larger libraries that your company might be using. And also you can just look at conference talks the maintainers have given, because that's a very big one where, for example, I was looking at React Drag and Drop, which is a very large library. I think it's React Beautiful D&D or something is like the NPM name. But anyway, it's deprecated now. But Atlassian has been like thanklessly maintaining it for a very long time, or some maintainers at Atlassian. And they recently came out with an entirely new version. And they have given multiple conference talks at meetups, tutorials, screencasts, stuff like that are so useful, that show like, this is how you can migrate to this new library. These are some cool possibilities with it, where you see that and you're just like, oh, I should just, this is all I actually need. They have all of this information publicly, and so I don't actually need to contact them either. So there's options for you, chances are.
That's some great advice. Thank you for that. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about local first software. I've been hearing more murmurs of this in the community, especially in the last 6 months or so. And I know that's something, I wanted to get your take on it, because I know that you had mentioned it's something that you're interested in and have some opinions about. So for those that might not be familiar with the term, what is local first software mean, and how are you thinking about it?
I think of local first software as software that is made to be local, like without the cloud, without a database somewhere out in the world, that can sync across devices, where like it does have some aspect of internet if you want it. But otherwise, if you're doing an international flight or something and don't want to spring for the Wi-Fi package, you can still use this software. And There is a lot of software out there that does that already, a lot of games, for example. But I think we as developers, as a society, we've definitely leaned way more into the everything is on the internet thing for a very long time. And I think there's a trend now to go back to what if it wasn't on the internet? Or what if it works fairly well without the internet, and then when you have the internet, it's kind of an added bonus. And I've been using some software lately that is local first, that is so dang nice that I'm kind of just leaning into it for most things that I've been just building for myself lately. And one that I'll talk about really quickly is Obsidian, which is a note-taking software. I love Obsidian. I think it's a glorified markdown editor where the notepad but markdown, but so much more because you can kind of create a wiki for yourself that like backlinks between documents, and as you start to use it more and more, there's a plugin system, and so you can use that where I have like a templating plugin and like a data view plugin that lets me kind of query my own notes and stuff like that. It is fully local first, where I wrote a few blog posts on the airplane using the software, was able to use my plugins and everything, didn't touch the internet at all, and it just worked. I love that, where I came from using like Notion and other softwares where if you have slow internet, it just doesn't work. And that's kind of a pain, where it's great and fully featured when you are on your home machine and everything is working fine, but when you are on the go and you want to just use your app and not have to rely on the cloud, that's really, really annoying. So anyway, I am very into the concept of local first software, and I think more software should be local first.
It's interesting because it sounds to me like how software was.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a pendulum swing, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I think about, some of my favorite tools are ones I've been using for a long time. Like I've been using cultured things, there's things, it's like a to-do app thing that I've been using for like 20 years or something. And I remember when they added cloud syncing, I'm like, oh great, I can sync between my devices, but it's never been the thing that, the syncing part was the important part, but between devices, because I was using it before I even had like an iPhone, and then when I had an iPhone at some point, I was like, oh, and I can have my to-do list here as well. And here, I don't fully understand local first. I'm just here to come. So that's interesting how you're thinking about it there, and I've heard like kind of a variation of it. That's a little bit also about like owning your data is another part of it as well.
Yes. I do think, yeah, your own like data portability is really nice. Where if, for example, Obsidian ever goes down, I still have all of my files, and like I could just put them into some other note-taking app, and things like that I think really matter. Again, right now with this era of AI, and you don't know where your next social network's going to be, things like that. Like I think about, for example, just all the posts I've made on Twitter. I'm like, dang, some of those were pretty good. And I don't know where this platform's going. And it'll probably be around, but it feels different because the platform just isn't what it was. And so I've been like leaning into writing my own blog, for example, more, and hosting my own blog, and maybe it's just becoming an internet hermit, but I think the concept of owning as much of your own data as possible is really valuable.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I just want to take a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We're a software consultancy. We help organizations with existing legacy applications make them better and more maintainable. We predominantly work with Ruby on Rails, but we also do a little bit of React, some Laravel, PHP stuff, JavaScript. Yeah, if you know any applications that might need some help, get in touch with us at planetargon.com. Once again, that's planetargon.com. We're here to help. Agreed. I'm in a similar space now. I'm trying to think about, like, I need to think about the channels that you're releasing your content through, or whether we want to call it content or whatever, but it's just like my thoughts and opinions, or whether that be video, audio, text, things, and sharing that with a wider community, and be able to own the space where that's being hosted in a way of your channel, distribution channel is completely owned by the whims of whoever, then you're not guaranteed that you're going to get to dictate how you show up in that in those algorithms, right? And so I think it's been interesting watching, people like you build your communities and people are coming to you and you're using things like Discord. You could potentially switch that somewhere else at some point and hopefully bring over most of those people. And it's just like trying to think about how you think about the long-term location, and people also hearing about people complaining that they might be on a Slack community and after X number of months, the messages start to go away. And I'm like, well, and they're like, Discord is better because it doesn't do that. I'm like, we don't know that it's always not going to do that. It could happen in a year from now. Could be a thing that happens in a year or two. Who knows? So owning your data.
Right. Yeah. No, it's exactly where I'm just like, I hope Discord doesn't start doing this because I really like it right now. But yeah, it's the nature of the beast.
I'm also, one of the things I wanted to quickly also give you a chance to plug is one of your side projects called Jumblie. Did I pronounce that right? Jumblie?
Oh yeah, Jumblie.
Yeah. I played it for the first time yesterday. Would play again.
Oh, thanks. It is a word game that I initially just kind of made for fun for like a hackathon project that I was doing with some folks, and it was so fun that I just kept working on it, and then people started playing it, and now I'm a puzzle editor. Where it is a word game. You can find it at jumblie.com, where it's kind of similar to like the Connections games out there, but it's words where there's a pile of letters and there's 4 words within the letters and there's a theme. Pull out the letters and try to make the words. And it was a really fun thing to build where, because I was doing it for a hackathon and because I was doing this to be arrogant, I built it in probably the worst way possible, where it uses 0 libraries whatsoever, just plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, which I honestly am still feeling kind of cocky about, but at the same time, it's much harder to maintain now. But anyway, it has been going for almost 300 puzzles now, which like 300 days in a row of puzzles. And it's been fun to see all of the people using it who are not in my usual circles whatsoever, where I have people who are saying like, my grandma plays it every single day and stuff like that. And now I'm just like, I want to keep this alive. And so, yeah, play Jumblie. It's been very fun to kind of maintain and work on, and it is open source. Although I haven't really like shilled the open source repo because once again it's kind of a pain to maintain. But it's a fun game that I've been really happy to work on.
I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes where people could spend some time. I'm also, just a couple of quick topics I want to kind of pivot over to again. Back to technical debt, and like, I'm curious is like, for those listening that might be working on a project and working at a company for several years, and they might be dealing with some challenges or things that are hindering for them from making some progress as a developer, but they might have asked for time or permission to get some time to work on, hey, can we work on addressing some of these things? And they've heard, not right now, maybe a few times, and it's been a while since they've last asked, but because they've heard not right now a few too many times, they start thinking that maybe it's no longer worth asking about because it's not a priority, seemingly. Do you have any advice on how they might maybe take some action on that?
Yeah, so something that I think works particularly well that I've seen work at a couple different companies is kind of making a developer wish list of these are the things that I would like to change in the code base, and it can be a small blurb, it could be a detailed one, but just kind of list the things. It'd be just like, this is my list. This is my pure golden list of things that I want. Where there have been times where I've seen engineers on teams where they're very public about like, this is my list. If I get time, I want to work on things on my list. And there have been times where other engineers are just like, hey, I have some time. Can I take something off of your list? And they're like, yes, please. And it kind of makes it better for everyone. I think that having some kind of source of truth of the things that you want to work on, whether it's to improve the code base, improve yourself, something like that, having that be a public thing that folks can see and know about, whether it's your manager or higher ups or other engineers, I think that works more well than you'd think because it's out there and it's been communicated and it's something that can be brought up multiple times and like that I've seen at some places where it's gotten to the point where people say, add it to the list. This one needs to be added to the list. And it becomes more of a communal thing of how people want to kind of band together and maintain something together.
Yeah, I think about, it's interesting thinking about it being a say my list versus our list. Do you think there's an important distinction there that kind of helps, you make, oh, that's on your list. Can I take that off of your list for you? And I'll address that type of thing, versus if you put it in a shared list and you're kind of like collectively hoping like, when is one of us going to do something, or you're waiting for someone else, versus like, that's on my list. And if that's on someone else's list, or this is on, is there more, you feel like there's maybe some interesting psychological thing that makes that a little bit more, maybe, I'm not saying, I don't know if it's better or not, but like, do you think that changes the dynamic a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's I'm sure some kind of bystander effect thing there, and like who owns what, who owns being annoyed at this particular problem. I haven't seen problems with that yet. It's probably good to think about it in that way. I think just make your own list, own your list. If it happens to be on someone else's list, cool, it's a race. But communicate if you're working on it. Leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm just curious if I'm even thinking about it for my own role. I'm like, well, maybe I should make my list of like, here's things I would love to address at some point. If anyone else has an idea that wants to hit it.
Right. It's like making issues on your own repo, but it's your list.
I like that. I don't feel like I've heard that particular take before, so I'm gonna do some thinking about that myself. Couple quick last questions for you, Cassidy. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
Ooh, okay. I've been very into the author Brandon Sanderson lately. He's so good. Like, I first heard about him because he did a Kickstarter a few years ago for some books, and people were like, oh, he's my favorite author, yay. And I was like, wow, I'll support this author. And I've learned more and more about that he's like the most productive author I've ever seen, where he just writes books on vacation and writes so many books, and every single book I've read of his has been so good. And I just finished his trilogy, the Mistborn trilogy. Mistborn is Mistborn. It was a fantastic trilogy where it was fun, but you're also like, there were twists all the way to the end, where there was a twist in like the last chapter of the third book where I was like, the whole time, like there are so many good things like that. And then he also has a really good standalone book called Tress of the Emerald Sea that I just finished, that was so good. Like it was just a really good, wholesome story that like I can't wait to read to my baby one day. It was really good.
Well, awesome. I'll definitely include links to those in the show notes for our listeners. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering and mechanical keyboards and
all that jazz? Probably my website is the best place these days, cassidoo.co, CASSIDOO.co. But you can find me at Cassidoo on most places, and you'll see me shouting somewhere. If you look up Cassidy Williams, you'll see a Scooby-Doo character, and I'm not the Scooby-Doo character, so I'm like second after that.
And that was not something that your parents thought about, or it might have impacted like your naming?
I think that it was a pure coincidence, where when I realized it, I was like, dang, I will never have the best SEO, but that's okay.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Maintainable, Cassidy. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Maintainable.